Hey guys, Wix100 here, back with another C# tutorial, and today I'm going to explain objects, classes, and structs. So an object is an abstract data type created by a developer. So that just means that it defines a type of data that you're storing for a variable. And an object can be a reference type or a value type, and it can contain other objects, properties, and methods. So a reference type would be a class, and a value type would be a struct. Now, what does reference and value types mean? So a reference type means that if you say, like if you have class C and class C2, if you say C2 equals C, then that just means that that C and C2 are both pointing to the same location in memory, and that if you change the values of C, you also change the values of C2 because they are the same. But with a value type or a struct, if you say you have struct S1 and struct S2, and you change a value and you say S2 equals S1, and then you change a value in S1, that does not change the value in S2, because by saying S2 equals S1, you're copying all the values over, and they are now separate. So let's begin. So we need to create a new project. We're going to do a console application, and let's call it objects, and put it in the right folder. And then I'm using .NET 5.0, but you can use the latest version of .NET Framework or .NET Core or practically any version. I don't know about the lower versions, but this should be pretty universal throughout different versions of C#. You hit create. And we can remove the console.writeLine because we are not making a hello world. And then let's right click on the objects project, click add new item, and say example struct. And then actually there is no struct option. So let's just make sure we have class selected. And so now we have a class called example struct. So let's just replace this word class with struct. And so with a struct, you cannot set an empty constructor, and you cannot determine what the default values of the variables within the struct would be. When you create if I were to create an instance of example struct here, and I do example struct es equals new example struct, that may look like it's calling a constructor. For those of you who know what a constructor is, I will go over that when we do the class example. But what it's doing is it's just setting all the variables in example struct, or in this instance of example struct, to be their default values. So if I have an int I and a string s, and let's say date time dt, creating es would create an example struct with an integer I at value 0, a string s at value null, and or empty string, and a date time with the value of whatever the default value for date time is. And if you notice, you hover over these, an int is actually an alias for int system.int32. That means 32-bit integer, and it is a struct. And string is system.string, and that's a class. And datetime is system.datetime, and that's a struct. So even default uh, the default data types are structs and classes. And so we can also put a constructor in here, but it cannot be an empty constructor. So like we would do public example struct, and what a constructor is actually, let me do I string as datetime dt. So what a constructor does is it basically assigns values to whatever object you're doing. So what is wrong with this? I must be fully assigned before control is returned to the caller. Okay, so that just means that we need to do this dot I equals I, this dot S equals S, and this dot dt equals dt. And so this dot just means that the scope it's looking for I here is this entire uh, struct. And that's because we need to distinguish that because we have an I that the scope is this constructor. And so we're saying the I up here is going to equal the I down here. The S up here is going to equal the S down here. And the DT up here is going to equal the DT down here. And so if we then instead go 100 hello world, and new date time, actually let's not even do that, let's do date time dot now. And if we do console dot write line, and we want to do $sign and 2 double quotes, and that is because the $sign before a string literal allows us to do this. And so we can do es.I, es dot, it would help if I made these all public. So es.I, es.s, and es.dt. And so these curly braces allows us to put code between the curly braces, and then it takes the output of that code and converts it to a string and just plugs it in there. So we should get 100 space hello world space and then the current date and time. And so let's run objects. 100 hello world 6/5/2021 4:55 24 p.m. So let's create an example class now. So add new item. Let's call this example class. So unlike a struct, a class is a reference type. So let's do the same thing we did before. So we can just copy this and paste it in, except first of all, that needs to be class now, except we can now do equals 10 equals goodbye, and equals new date time. Let's do 2001 1. So January 1st, 2001. And so if we go back to program.cs, that's the default file, we can do example class EC equals new example class. No, we can't. What if? So let's just create an empty constructor then. Public example class. So now we have an empty constructor and there's nothing in its body. So it should just set these at their default values. And paste this in and change these to C's and play. 10, goodbye, January 1st, 2001 at 12 a.m. Or we could always use the constructor here where we set the values. Let's say we want a second class. But instead of setting it to a new empty class, we just set it to equal EC. And because variables can't have the same names, let's call this EC2. So we will print out the values of EC and EC2. Then we will say EC dot I equals 3, because why not? And then we will print them out again. So if we run this again, they both say 10 goodbye in January 1st, and now they both say 3 goodbye in January 1st. And notice, we only changed the value of EC. We did not change the value of EC2. And that's because it's a reference. If we did the same thing up here with example struct ES2 equals ES, and we print out all the values, and then we say es.I equals, not es.I equals 10,000, then we can copy these values again, hit run, and it now says 100 and 100 because ES is set to that, and ES2 is set to the same thing. Then we modify ES1, or ES, but ES2 stays the same because it's copies, not references. You can also, if you want, let's say you want to put restrictions on variable values. You could do that a couple different ways. And a couple different reasons for wanting to put restrictions on variable values is, one, for security. If you're making this a class or a struct that gets referenced or that gets modified by some sort of user input, which is likely, then you wouldn't want a user to be able to input whatever and exploit some unknown security flaw, or maybe some known security flaw. So you would like to modify the data as it's being set, which means that these would have to be private, if I can type the word private properly. Let's just change these at the same time. Which means that we are now going to have errors here because they can no longer see those. But we can create a property. So what a property does is it allows you to modify the value that can be retrieved and that can be set. So we would want to do public int, and let's call this public I, just to avoid name confusion. You can call it whatever you want, just like with any other variable. And then we want to do get, and we want to do set. So get is called whenever, so here, if I want to do public I, this would be calling the get here. And so let's say we want to set a range on our internal I. We would say, let's say I can only be a value from 1 to 10, or from 0 to 10. So we would say get return math dot min I and 10. So it's going to get the minimum of the two. So if I is greater than 10, then it's only going to return 10. But you're then going to say, but what about the minimum? Do you want a minimum of 0? So we can do math.max 0. And so let's say I is 3. Then the minimum of 10 and 3 is 3. So that's going to compare 3 to 0. The maximum of 3 and 0 is 3. So that's a perfectly valid number. But let's say it's -1. The minimum of -1 and 10 is -1. So it's going to pass the first test. The minimum of -1 and, or the maximum of -1 and 0 is 0. So it's going to return 0. The setter is the opposite. If I would say ec dot I, or ec dot public I equals 3, then it calls the setter. And so we could put this same restriction on the setter, except we would say value and I equals. So if we say I, or public I equals 10, then the minimum of 10 and 10 is 10, and the maximum of 10 and 0 is 10. So that would be a fine value. And it'll set I equal to that. So that just puts restrictions on what you can do. I will make these. Testing. Okay. Sorry about that weird cut. My stuff unplugged somehow. And so we can set that to public. And all we have to do is wherever it says I for EC, we will set it to public I. And so if this is right, let's set that to 100. Then if I hit run, nothing from EC is greater than 10. So that's how properties work. And the last thing I'm going to show you are functions or methods. There is technically a difference between functions and methods, and I think the difference varies depending on what programming language you're using. But for the most part, functions and methods are the same thing, except I think the difference in C# is that one is of type void and the other has a return type. So we can say public void make date now. And so what we're going to do here is say dt equals datetime.now. And so if we call make date now, it will set dt equal to datetime.now. We could also have a public void set datetime. And what this would do instead is we would say datetime new dt and say dt equals new dt. And so this is a parameter, which is a variable that gets passed into this function. And when we call the function, so let's say ec dot set datetime, then we can do new datetime and it doesn't really matter. Let's say 21 and 3. And so it will then pass in this datetime, call this function, and set the datetime for EC, which is also the same datetime for EC2 because they're references, to the value of new DT. And so then let's copy this again because we want to do EC dot make datetime now. And so if we run this, we're now looking at the dates for changes. And so we set it to January 3rd of the year 20. And then we set it to now, which is June 5th, 2021. You can also have static classes, and static variables. So anything that would be static would be constant across all instances. So if I had public static void, not void, string, hey, hello world, then we can do example class dot hey equals hey. Nope, did not mean to highlight all, I meant to save. And so we can do console.writeLine example class dot hey, and then console.writeLine example class dot hey. Now notice I'm not calling EC for this, I'm calling example class, and that's because hey is not tied to a specific instance of example class. It's tied to example class as a whole. And so that means I don't call EC, which is an instance, I call example class itself. And so if I run it, hello world, then I change it to hey, and now it's just hey. And that works with structs as well. And you can even make a function or method static as well. And so these cannot be static because they reference a variable that is specific to an instance. But you can make a function in a class or struct that does not reference a specific variable, and then it's like if you want it to return a value, like public static is true, which would be, actually, it would be public static bool is true. And so let's have the parameter of bool b. Return b. Very simple. It's a useless function. It just returns the exact value that you put in. But notice it doesn't reference I, S, or DT. All it references is B. Or you can make it reference hey, and because hey is also static, it doesn't care about I, S, or DT, so it doesn't care about anything from this instance. And so that's the difference between static and non-static. So as always, this code will be uploaded to my GitHub. Links are down in the description. Links to any other relevant tutorials will also be down in the description. And this one will be added to pre-existing tutorials that this should have been added to before. Hope you liked this video. Like, comment, subscribe down in the description and above the description and whatnot. Check out my Infinity Programming Community Discord for all kinds of programming help and suggestions and sharing. Till next time, bye.